Guys, it's Jasmine, and I am going to do this video as quickly as I can. There's a lot of stuff I want to cover, as I said kind of in my last video for those of you who got a chance to catch it. I never ever intended to really be a vlogger, but when the idea really did start to kind of come into my head and my spirit, it was really with the intent of doing things about eschatology and end times. And so with the significance of the events that occurred with the George Floyd situation here in Minneapolis, I definitely wanted to take some time to stop, reflect, and respond, especially in light of my own personal experiences with racism and life as a Black woman in America. I didn't want to miss the opportunity to really address some issues that are actually important and really, as well as personally significant, and just kind of gloss over those, because I think that far too many people, especially in the church community, really did miss out on a great opportunity to address some things that really, I think, probably impacted and touched the heart of the Lord too, just with how we responded to the situation. So there's a lot of stuff that I want to cover in this, so I'm going to move as fast as I can through everything, and I'm going to do it in one take. I'm not going to redo this video, reshoot it. It took me a while to kind of consolidate all my thoughts, and so let's just kind of get rolling. Honestly, I really had to take a minute just to consider what kind of are my closing thoughts and ideas with regard to race and social injustices going on across the nation. And you'll see, I'm like going to glance from time to time at my notes. Don't let that distract you. I just, like I said, want to make sure that I'm being concise and I don't miss anything. But there were a few big kind of like parting thoughts that I wanted to leave you all with regards to the idea of like social justice and racism, because like I said, unless specifically prompted by the Lord, I'm gonna probably take a bit of a break from some videos on this particular topic so I can get back to the end times eschatology stuff that I was originally going to be focused on. So the big questions that I kind of wanted to address are, does white privilege and systemic racism really actually exist? And how would that differ from bias and racism? And then next would be, okay, so if it does exist, what is the incentive for the majority culture, which is white people in this particular situation, to dismantle it? And then what does that information do? And what does that mean for how the Black and Christian communities need to be responding? So with regard to the first set of questions about white privilege and systemic racism, and do they really exist, and how does that differ from bias and racism? And FYI, people are still shooting off fireworks, literally beautiful big fireworks shows. I don't know how much money people spent on fireworks this year, but we are well past the 4th of July and people still are sparkling up the sky, so entertaining. So hopefully that is not too distracting in the background if you can even hear it, but I'm gonna not let it distract me. So anyway, I'm just gonna go out on a limb here and say, yeah, white privilege absolutely does exist in modern Western culture. Shock of all shocks, right? But you know, I use modern pretty loosely because I mean, this modern society of Western culture has been around for centuries. You know, it basically started in 1619 when 20 slave ships filled with kidnapped African slaves docked in Jamestown, Virginia, that was 401 years ago. You know, so it's been a long-standing problem in our nation, and there's been these restrictive social systems that have been in place against Black people since we arrived here in the United States, which wasn't even the United States at the time. So slavery, obviously, we all know about that and the impacts of that. Then convict leasing was what it initially gave way to, and that was only effective by criminalizing the behaviors of Black men. And so that's where that whole Black people are criminals idea started, is right after the end of slavery, where you have to essentially find a way to make a prison working class system based on the laws and things that were in place. So you've got this convict leasing system that comes about, then that gives way to sharecropping, and you've got Jim Crow laws that again put this divide between social groups. You got redlining, which basically prevents certain banks and industries, whatever, from approving loans and things like that in certain neighborhoods. And then you've got racial housing covenants that existed in some areas even here until like 1968. So like that's not even a whole generation ago. Like that's people's parents and aunts and stuff like that, so and these basically were covenants that were built into the deeds of homes, saying that this particular home can only be sold to someone of this particular demographic. So now you've got these things in place that are restricting your access to essentially social mobility and economic mobility, and so then you have this kind of war-torn nation that basically, as time goes on, you've got all these other things that are impacting what is available to people in certain communities. And then when society as a whole starts to fall on hard times, jobs get moved to areas that happen to not be areas that are heavily populated by these black people who are not basically having the access to live in certain areas. And so now you don't have jobs in these areas. They're falling on tough times, and crime and drug use starts to increase, which is common in economically deprived areas, whether it's opiates in Afghanistan or something like that, like opium, heroin, those type of things, where they were coming from other nations in some cases, because sometimes this is where this stuff is grown. But these are economically deprived systems, and they're finding some sort of outlet to their stress, as well as a criminal inroad to economics that maybe they don't have access to otherwise. So then you crack down with war on drugs and tough on crime and rule of law reforms that increase the prison population, exponentially, and supports these, similar to the convict leasing programs of the olden days, these prison industrial reform type private prisons and things like that, where they're using the labor in the prisons to subsidize, the manufacturing or whatever kind of labor that is required for these industries, and so then the question could be posed, well, okay, well, what about the black people in the 50s and 60s? They seemed so much more happy and respectable and stuff like that. And yes, and they were also getting hosed down with water hoses in the street, and chased down with dogs, and hung from trees, and crosses burned in their yards and stuff like that. So it's not all hunky-dory and stuff like that. But if you're going to make the argument with regards to they had homes that seemed relatively stable and happy or whatever, okay, I will give you that. As we know, there's plenty of statistics that show that not having the father in your home puts you at a disadvantage to significant number of things. There's a 71% of all teen pregnancies, high school dropouts, and state institutionalized juvenile delinquents come from fatherless homes. So fatherless kids are 5 times more likely to live in poverty. They're 2 times more likely to go to jail, actual jail, or abuse substances. They're 4 times more likely to suffer from mental health problems, and they're 13% more likely to commit suicide. So now you've got all these other issues that, regardless of race, you have to contend with if you are in a fatherless society. But let's back it up and see all these things that have been in place now that create kind of a generational culture of fatherlessness. The prison reform and war on drugs things, those were more of the 80s. But then right before the 70s, you have these these homes where, like I said, you've got folks who are an American economy that's kind of reeling at the moment from different things. And so now you've got a large population of black families who now can't they can't go where the jobs are, and so they need assistance. And then you have these programs that are put into place that basically the Man in the House Act prevented people from receiving, social services if there was a man in the house. And they're doing midnight raids, like actual raids, not necessarily at midnight, but night raids in homes to ensure that there isn't a man living in these homes that are receiving aid. And so now you've got basically a culture that has decided, well, if I'm going to protect and feed and care for my family or whatever, I need to ensure that I don't have a man in the home because I can't afford it without it. And that's the only way to provide for my family. And so yes, you could make the argument, well, just don't have the kids. Like, okay, yeah, I think that that's pretty harsh to say to a woman who's like, I want to live a somewhat normal existence and leave maybe some sort of legacy. I think that's very selfish to try to impose that on someone, to say, you shouldn't wish for a family, but now you've got these things in place that basically make it very difficult to keep a man in the house. Between jail and the No Man in the Home Act, these underprivileged areas are getting basically riddled with all of the effects of fatherlessness for an entire generation, and then around the same time in the 80s, this introduction of this idea of the model minority, where it basically pits minority groups that are not black against the black community, saying like, well, if this particular minority group could do it, look at, why can't you do it? But there's other factors at play, and I don't think that maybe the intention behind it was initially malicious, but I can't say, and it's not my job to kind of determine whether or not the intention behind it was malicious, but that's what happened. And the impact is that you now have all these stereotypes that are being perpetuated in the media and just in people's day-to-day lives and experiences. And it's just playing to this idea of like servitude, particularly in black women, but service industry type of roles, much akin to the days of slavery and sharecropping and all this kind of stuff. And then physical prowess. So now you do have your athletes and your exceptional folks who, again, you're back in the slave block days, people were being paraded up on stage butt naked, embarrassed, just to show off how strong and powerful or whatever they would be as kind of like a work resource, so I don't think that the idea of this like physical aptitude and stuff like that, while it may have merits, and I don't want to undermine how hard the people who are in these industries have to work to be successful in them, it's just glorification of those particular things, and jesting, entertaining. You see throughout all of history that you've got court jesters and things, just kind of entertainment, mindless things that I would say aren't particularly well respected. And then you have this idea, this criminology type of a mindset towards black people, and so that has been ingrained from right after slavery, because you've got these industries, like I said, this whole thing where you've got your convict leasing, where you're reliant on criminals to basically take the place of your slave labor, and so you criminalize the behaviors of the black community. And so I think when you look at all of that and you look at all these stereotypes that are being reinforced, like I said, in the media and stuff like that, you basically create some really, really bad perceptions and things that are hard to overcome. And so you say, okay, well, what about these things that have overcorrected, like affirmative action? Like, how is that fair? And I would say that you should go and check out data from the Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics. And yes, I will concede that it shows that black students do receive grant style, like scholarship funding, I suppose, if you want to call it like that, at a 14% higher rate than white students. So that's a legitimate, maybe it's beneficial, But the schools that they're attending are also 4% cheaper, which in my mind means that they're probably getting a slightly lower quality education overall when you're averaging this out across both demographics. But but the differences aren't super significant. And then when you look at enrollment rates by 2018, 42% of white students were enrolled in undergraduate, whereas 14% of blacks and 19% of Hispanics were. So, it's overall, I would say the numbers are not stellar for anybody, really. So, I think that it there's still a lot of work to be done. I'm just going to leave it at that. But then, okay, if you say, all right, well, that's undergraduate, but what about jobs? Okay, so companies that are incentivized to hire diverse candidates can hire any sort of folks that constitute as diversity. In some cases, post 9/11 war veterans would count as diverse. So a white male who is a service member would be an element of diversity that would count towards your head count or quotas of hiring diverse groups. A Caucasian woman, because she's a woman, she would count towards your numbers of diversity. A Hispanic person, and as we saw in terms of their enrollment numbers in undergrad, 14% of blacks and 19% of Hispanics. Even in enrollment in college at this point, we're seeing a slight uptick in enrollment in the Hispanic population than in the black population, and so I imagine that doesn't probably stray too far from reality even within companies. But I think what people fail to acknowledge is the fact that these diversity initiatives that are being kind of pushed or whatever by these companies, there's not necessarily a rule as to what position these people have to fill within your organization. So you could be a high-powered tech company and you hire a black janitor or a white female kitchen worker or a Hispanic person who is in a customer service call center because they're bilingual or something like that, and they still count as a number towards your diversity numbers that you can publish at the end of the year. And you can say, yes, 20% of our demographic in our company is diverse, but you're not saying what roles they're holding, and in many cases they're not holding roles that have any significant influence or power or anything like that. And that's not even to get into the debate about, oh, well, are they qualified or not? If you want qualified people of different groups, you can find a qualified person from any ethnic background. Many of the best companies are happy to relocate any qualified candidate they find of any color. So why would, if you for some reason live in an area or host your company in an area that doesn't have the appropriately qualified candidate that you're looking for, why would you not expand your search? But I think, unfortunately, biases make people assume that people are either not qualified for a role or are receiving a role because of some sort of affirmative action thing. So it's a really unfortunate situation. But okay, so what if we're to argue the fact that yes, these things, they have been horrible, but there's been a lot of overcorrecting, and a lot of the systems that were in place are actually dismantled at this point. And I would venture to say, great, I'm glad that they are, and I think that probably a good chunk of them genuinely have been dismantled. But I don't think that you can get away so easily from the long-held and lingering effects of these societally ingrained ideas about black people as criminals, as just comical jesters or servitude, people who should be in some sort of servitude or service industry, or who happen to have some exponential physical capability, and so those negative ideas are reinforced even in current cultural media. And I will push back and say, like, it is the responsibility of the black actors and actresses and musicians and things like that to push back when you're offered a role and say, hey, like, I don't feel like this is a role that I should take because I don't like the stereotypes and stuff like that that are being perpetuated, you know. And I get it, because at the end of the day, there's somebody who's probably going to be willing to take the role, and so it's like, if you don't do it, somebody else will. And so I get the personal nature of that, but I do think that it makes it really hard to argue against, in some cases, those negative images that are pervading our whole society, if the black leaders and celebrities and stuff like that in those roles aren't willing to say, you can keep your money, I'm not going to perpetuate these ideas anymore, you know. And it's tough. It's a really tough call. So I just really think that between that, the model minority, you know, ideas and comparisons on these economic systems that, you know, okay, even if some of the laws and systems are not in place, you've got these lingering effects of, you know, being generations behind, and these biases that impact the perceptions of the power holders and the stakeholders who are going to be hiring and going to be admitting people to their organization, or you know, promoting some new celebrity or promoting some new thought leader or whatever. And you know, what's even, I think, super unfortunate too, is that even the idea of model minority has even pitted like African born immigrants against natively born American blacks, you know. And it's just a really unfortunate situation. And so, you know, if you push back and you say, okay, well, other people are disadvantaged too, I would say that's very true. And these ethno-nationalistic ideologies are not just limited to the United States. You know, in Finland, you've got these Romani minority groups that are kind of discriminated against and oppressed. If you look at the ethnic conflicts in Myanmar and the Sunni-Shia conflicts in the Islamic world, North and South Korean divisions, and Hong Kong versus mainland China divisions, and then you've got genocide in Darfur and Rwanda, and the Tutsis and the Hutus in Burundi, and the caste systems of India, and then you've got your nationalist versus your unionist conflicts in Ireland. Like, this stuff has been going on for generations, and you can always find some way to divide up your nation, whether it's color or not. And color just happens to be super easy, super, you know, well identifiable. And so in the United States, the devil certainly has a foothold there, because it's like you don't even need to think about, like, how would I divide this particular thing up, because you can just look and just see the differences. And so, like, in the United States, it doesn't just stop at color. You've got disability and ability disparities. You've got age disparities. Economic disparities are huge. And then social capital, especially in today's modern world, like, social capital can be followers or clout or attractiveness. You know, there's plenty of women who basically have a whole lot of clout, and the only thing that they seem to have going for them is the fact that they're incredibly attractive, you know. And so that's just the world that we live in, and there's other so there are other things in society besides just color that create disparity. But I mean, I want to say that, like, the black community within the United States has faced their issues all the while, you know, Native Americans have been relegated to reservations, and you had the Chinese Exclusion Act, and Japanese people put in internment camps, and then Irishmen being subject to subpar treatment during their immigration to the United States, and Hispanic immigrants constantly being relegated to injustices and workplace disparities and things like that in modern day America. But I mean, even heck, during the time of slavery, you even had low-income whites who were working as indentured servants or overseers for black people who were slaves. So even there, not every single white person who was alive during that era was maybe a slaveholder, because maybe they just didn't have the resources to be a slaveholder, and so they basically became middle management over slaves, you know, which again, not saying that that's a good thing, not saying that's excusable, but I just think that it's like, okay, you know, there were even different levels within the white community as well. So I think the tough part about it is when you look and you see all these other groups that have kind of gone on to be successful since that time, and not every single group has. By no means am I saying that that is the case. Especially, you know, if you look at the Native American communities, there are some improvements to the conditions that they've had to survive in, but you know, they still are very much oppressed, and as are other groups as well. But I would say the good thing for everyone else, and I say that lightly, is that they could always essentially look to the Black community as being lower on the caste ring, or, you know, social comparison ladder. The Black community had consistently stayed on the bottom, and that's Black American. Like I said, the Black African community within America is at a slightly different level, and I think that because a lot of the immigration changes over the years, people being admitted from other countries, particularly countries where the look isn't homogenous and there isn't maybe the desire to really fully assimilate that particular culture into our nation, there were things in place to ensure that you only had the best people coming in. And you know, I'm not here to argue whether or not that was a great idea or a bad idea, but I think that, you know, now you've got, with regards to maybe African people who are immigrating over, you've got people that maybe you see as like, okay, they're going to have a lot of high potential, and so they're being viewed, the biases and things that are being projected on them as they arrive are different from the biases that are already ingrained in society against maybe the Black community. And so, okay, so say we say all that and we say white privilege seems to exist, maybe a lot of the systemic things and the racial things that are blatant and overt, intended to keep the Black community like in their place per se. Maybe those things have been dismantled, but there's maybe a few things that are still lingering. So what's the incentive for the white community to dismantle it, if they're currently the ones who at the moment maintain the most decision-making power to be able to change and influence? And so I would say if we were a nation that really truly valued altruism and opportunities for the best thought leaders and innovators to come to the forefront of our nation, then there would be a heck of a lot of an incentive for the majority culture, which is kind of, you know, like I said in this discussion, the white people who overall have the highest percentage of people in decision-making positions at the moment in America. Those folks would have a lot of incentive to get diversity. Diverse thought creates more well-rounded solutions and innovation for problems. But sadly, I would argue that if you're in an ego-centered culture and an egocentric society that's selfish and prideful, then everyone really kind of has to look out for themselves. And I would also just reiterate kind of what I said before. If you look and you say societally, if it's a ladder and the Black American communities have historically fallen on the lowest rung of it, any societal progress that is experienced by the Black community would be by default experienced by other marginalized groups as well. And just, I kind of like the image in my mind is like a push pop, how, you know, you lift up the popsicle thing, the part at the bottom, like everything else has to rise up to the top as well too. And so, you know, while I don't think that that's intended to be a metaphor to say pushing anyone else up out of their position, I think anything that would even remotely resemble equality does mean displacing some people who are currently in their seats from maintaining all of the seats. And I think that in a society that is already just kind of scraping to get by, yes, America is one of the richest nations in the world in theory, but 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. And I think coronavirus and quarantine only proved how true that was. You see these companies that you thought, oh, this is a well-to-do organization, stuff like that, and they go bankrupt within the first month of quarantine because they can't maintain the cost of living, because their resources just aren't in place to be able to sustain it. So if 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, I can really only imagine that everyone is truly just looking out for the best opportunities for themselves and their future generations. And so while it's a great theory and a great idea for people to say, I want to stand up for others, I think that it really isn't realistic to assume that most people are willing to relinquish a lot of their comforts, especially in such an egocentric society that we live in 2020, to think that there's really going to be a lot done by other people to ensure another group can progress. And so, given that, I think that it's important for the Black community to realize a couple of things, and the first one being that most people are just facing their own struggles, and because there isn't a ton of incentive to help the Black community to progress it up to a point where everything feels 100% equal, that's work that we're going to have to do ourselves. Like, we're just going to have to do that work ourselves, and just own that fact, and be okay with it too. And acknowledge that biases and prejudices against Black people that we actually hold against our own selves too. So that could be a whole nother video, which, like I said, I'm not going to do a whole lot of other videos, but you can feel free to Google to your heart's content colorism and Black women, Black men issues and conflicts and internal self-hatred, I suppose, if you want to call it that, in the most extreme forms within the Black community. Like, you can see that a lot. And so I'm not saying that what I am saying is that those biases and those prejudices have not only worked their way through the rest of society, but they've also made their way into our own societal hearts and minds as well. And they exist, and they might not always have malicious origins. And so I think that it's really, really important to try to extend grace to the people who are really trying. Slavery and Jim Crow and all of these other systems that are in place, did our grandparents and great-grandparents and things like that live through these things? Yes. Do we have those stories and those memories and stuff being passed down from generation to generation, influencing how we see the world? Absolutely. Did we have any more control over how we were born and to whom we were born than the white person next to us? No. So I think that when we are confronted with people who are trying and they're not really, maybe due to ignorance or whatever, they're just making some mistakes, try to extend a little bit of grace if you can. But then on the flip side, again, we got to do the work. So if there's systems that are still lingering that need to be dismantled, we need to work to correct them. We need to find the proper channels to address them and focus our attention and take those things down one by one in a legal or whatever process needs to be done. Like, we can come together when it let me take that back. We can come together when we want to. We don't always come together when it matters or for things that matter. Sometimes we come together for things that we're like, well, that was kind of a silly thing, and in the grand scheme of things, does that really actually help the actual day-to-day life of any Black person? Like, maybe not, So I think instead of just banding together for to back a celebrity or something like that, maybe who's going through a hard time, we need to come together for things that we see that are unjust, that need some systemic, legal reforms and stuff like that to help better our world. And then just decide that the things that are going to be best for us, like, that we have to do them for ourselves, and who cares what society says or thinks or does about who we are? I think there are enough other people who have been in this nation who have had negative perceptions about them that maybe they were different, and maybe they were shorter lived, and maybe they were more likely to be forgiven, because again, there's a comparison game being played between their communities and the Black communities. Regardless, I think that it doesn't matter what other people think about us. We have to do what is best for our own lives and our own families, and I think anyone could acknowledge that. And then finally, and most importantly for the Christian community, I think there's a few things that we really need to keep in mind. Is like, we should not be so glued to our traditions and our politics that we don't look at issues and look at people through the lens of how God sees them. I was looking at the sky one day and I saw how beautiful it is, and I saw how, every single day for as long as the world has existed, the sky has never looked the same. Like, there's not one day where you would have been able to take a picture of the entire sky across the entire earth and it looked the same. And I was just like, how beautiful and how amazing is that? And when you think about it, God has made so many different people from so many different eras and generations with different personalities and types and stuff like that. And with us being made in God's image, like Genesis 1:28, like, God needed that constant, to use the word evolution of people over generations and generations to even give us a glimpse of what his own character and personality and stuff like that is like. And so I'm like, wow, what a beautiful kind of thought. And so the fact is that we need to be able to look at people that way and see them how God sees them, as like a beautiful reflection, like one little tiny sliver of a beautiful reflection of like what he's like. And so modern day church, we tend to equate the Republican right with faith, and then we are quick to shoot down any legitimate issues that are being presented by the left without truly looking at the issue at hand. And I say this as someone who generally leans right politically. I would consider myself more of a centrist, but I tend to lean right because I do have some conservative values. But I think that we have gone way too far in the Christian community, especially the white Christian community. I'm not trying to pick any fights or anything like that, but like, we have really overcorrected to the fact that we think that the left, just by sheer fact that it's the left, is wrong in everything that they do. And in some cases, what's happening is we're coming across as very hypocritical and unloving to the people who are looking on to our witness, trying to decide if they want to follow Christ or not. Derek Minor posted a good video. It was relatively short, but it posted a really good video, as have some other folks. I think Lecrae posted one as well. It was just basically talking about how there's so much of a controversy and uproar about like the Black Lives Matter organization itself. And like, okay, yeah, there's indications that the Black Lives Matter organization is more it's funded by the same organizations that like a lot of Democratic candidates are funded by and stuff like that. And so because it leans left and the organization is not something people believe in, they don't like the sentiment and the words of Black Lives Matter. And it's just like, those words in and of themselves and the heart behind those words should be easily detached from the organization. Jesus left the 99 to find the one, and I think that this is a situation where it's like the one of many, but in this particular situation, the one group that's saying, hey, like, don't leave us out, is asking to not be ignored by the Christian community just because it is what people are identifying as a political move by the right. And in some cases that is accurate, but I think that we need to examine how we approach things and what we're doing, whether or not they're loving or unloving, if they're hypocritical, if they're, encouraging sin, or they're lovingly balancing grace and truth. But I think that, it's tough, because if you don't acknowledge that racial injustices are real, and the fact that you are ultimately responsible for how you treat others to God. The robes and the crowns and the jobs and the tasks that you're going to have in your eternity are going to be based off of what you do in this lifetime, in this world. And so in Matthew 25:32 through 40, it says, like, all the nations will be gathered before him, and he'll separate the sheep from the goats. He'll put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left, and that's where the left and the right came from. In any case, it's just funny. And the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you took care of me. And I was in prison, and you visited me." And then the righteous will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or feed you when you were thirsty, or give you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger and take you in, or without clothes? And when did we see you sick or in prison?" And the king said to them, "I assure you that whatever you did for the least of these brothers of mine, you did for me." And so again, I think, we're in this big old cancel culture society that exists today, and that's in direct defiance to how Jesus operated and how he treated people. When someone sins against you, you're supposed to be able to forgive 70 times 7, Matthew 18:21, 22. The woman at the well who was a Samaritan, which was like the most least approved and desirable ethnic group, and she was a woman and she was a sinner, so she had all the strikes against her, but yet he talked to her. And the woman who was in adultery and was going to get stoned, and Zacchaeus, a tax collector, so he's a scam artist, and rich scam artist. And even Peter and Judas, who, these are people who are going to betray him in the last hours of his life. He still forgave them, fed them, washed their feet, and even on the cross, he looked and he's like, "Forgive them, Father, for they don't know what they're doing." So Jesus was very much not a cancel culture type of a person, and so I feel like that's a very dangerous trap for us to get involved in as Christians in a Christian community with regard to all of this. And so, as we look at this battle for image, like I mentioned before, we are made in God's image. And so I think that is to say that if you have a problem uttering the words Black Lives Matter or agreeing with the sentiment, detached from the organization itself, but if you have an issue agreeing with that sentiment, you should definitely check your heart, because the Lord will certainly check it when you get and stand before his throne. But you should definitely check your heart and see if there's a reason why you cannot see how this person, this black person, or anyone else, white person, if you're a black person, whatever, is not made in the image of God, and we have to recognize this is a trap. This is a battle for image. God made us in his image, and so the devil is battling for image. Even the very first sin was Satan trying to trick Eve into thinking that she's something that she wasn't. The Bible says that we're made in God's image, but yet Satan comes to Eve and says, "Don't you want to be like God? Eat this apple," basically, if it's an apple, whatever it is. And so she's just thinking "Oh yeah, I do want to be like God," and she was already made in the image of God, So we have to acknowledge that we are made in God's image, all of us. Some of us don't act like we are, but that doesn't detract from the fact that we are. And so that battle for image, we have to acknowledge, is a real, true fight that we can't let the enemy win. And it's an easy way to divide people is to start to identifying people by other things, whether it's some sort of, you are allowing what you have, or what your sin is, or what your culture is, or what your job is, or whatever. You allow those things to start becoming your image, and then it becomes us versus them. I want to wear a coronavirus mask. I don't. You're infringing on my rights. it's all divisive, and it's all trying to put labels and images on you that have no bearing on what God actually created you to be. And so again, I would say just don't allow society to force you to accept an image of yourself that differs from what the Bible has already said about you. It says that we're blessed and we're highly favored. We're in the world, we're not of the world. We're royal priesthoods, holy nation, beloved, dearly beloved children of God, And so I think no matter how far the chips are stacked against us, whether we are going into a battle and we see, that we look like grasshoppers in their sight, and so we look like grasshoppers in our own sight, like, regardless of how the chips are stacked, if we are Christians, whether you are a poor Christian who's white and you live in a single parent home in a trailer in North Dakota somewhere, or you are a black billionaire or whatever who's got your own TV station, or whatever the lot in life that you've inherited, you're a Hispanic lady who is in a wheelchair, or whatever, however life has handed you some cards, like, if we are part of the body of Christ, like the trump card, if you want to use that to be cute and use that, the trump card for us as Christians is the fact that we are children of God, and so He will allow us to have favor and inroads and things that, like, maybe don't make sense for us to have. Like Queen Esther, she was a poor Jewish orphan. Paul was a criminal and was imprisoned many times, and but he was super well educated and bilingual or multilingual, and he had the silver spoon in his mouth, from the right town and right culture, but and many of the disciples, on contrast, were just common laborers, fishermen and carpenters and things like that. Then Joseph was a human trafficked foreign guy who ended up in jail, and Moses literally was the baby that was thrown out with the bathwater. So I just say all that to say I'm wrapping up my whole discussion on race and culture and stuff like that, at least within the vlog forum. There's still plenty that I'm going to be doing within my own personal sphere and community. If this particular video happens to reach outside of my sphere, great. But I think I wanted to do this video to wrap up some of the ideas and things that I had. And again, there are countless numbers of other resources that are available for Christian community, non-Christian community, black community, white community, whatever, on either how to be an ally, how to be anti-racist, how to truly love others, what is systemic racism, what it has historically marginalized the black community, those sort of things. And so this particular video, again, if it hasn't been clear in other videos and stuff like that, this particular video was more of my tribute to, I am a black woman in America. I do have experiences that are negative because of my color as a black woman in America, but I am a Christian woman first and foremost, and so that is where my identity falls, and that is where my decision-making process really starts. And so there's a lot of things that are being done in society, in the black community, in the Christian community, that really I don't think are in alignment with what God's will and His heart are. And so this final video is just a hope that maybe we can course correct a little bit and head in the right direction. So hope you guys have a great night. Super excited to actually get a chance to get into eschatology and end times and stuff more. But again, I didn't want to bypass this very rare, very special opportunity in history to make an attempt to address some racial issues. I don't think, just like the poor you'll have with you always, I think that these divisions and castes and strife stuff like that. We've always had them from Cain and Abel to now. We've always had divisions, and until Jesus comes back, I don't think that will ever fully correct. And so again, it's just another reason why fight the battles that matter, the battles that matter in the course of eternity, and just keep in mind the fact that like you will still have to answer for all your individual decisions by yourself as you stand alone before the throne of judgment. So if you are doing something that you feel comfortable having to give an account for, have at it. But in any case, God bless you guys. Have a great night, great day, whatever time you're watching this. Enjoy it, and see you for some eschatology videos.